The first alarm did not come from radar. It came from silence. One moment, every communication channel from Earth was alive, cargo manifests, weather data, news feeds, personal transmissions from families and friends going about their days. The next moment, all of it vanished. Not interrupted, not scrambled, just gone, as if someone had reached into the electromagnetic spectrum and torn out the thread that connected a planet to the rest of the universe. I was at my station aboard Luna Base, tracking a routine fuel delivery from the European Orbital Depot, when the displays went blank. My colleague Owen Clark looked up from his panel with a confused expression. He opened his mouth to say something. Then the observation window turned white. Not the white of sunlight, the wrong kind of white, the kind that comes from something being destroyed at very high speed. It bloomed outward in rings above the surface of Earth far below us, and then another bloom appeared further east, and then another, and the rings multiplied until the planet looked like it was covered in flowers made of fire. I pressed my palms flat against the console to stop my hands from shaking, and I watched. The impacts came in sequences, 7, then 12, then more than I could count. Kinetic projectiles dropped from orbit, no explosive charge required when the mass and velocity are high enough. They fell in patterns that told me they were targeted, not random, specific. The fires appeared over population centers, over power grids, over the network nodes that kept civilization connected. Owen was already on the emergency line, shouting coordinates and requesting confirmation from Earth Command. No confirmation came. The surface feeds were frozen. The emergency channels broadcast nothing but static. The only sounds in our station were the alarm tones and the sound of people trying to reach someone who could no longer answer. I sat down at my terminal and started recording. I did not think about it. I did not make a conscious decision. My hands moved on their own, pulling up every sensor output available, tagging each reading with a timestamp, capturing the frequency signatures of the weapons, noting the positions and vectors of the ships appearing on long-range radar. There were a lot of them, more than I could account for with any defensive theory I had ever studied. The fleet came out of a fold point above the southern hemisphere. The ships were enormous and built without a single curved line anywhere on them, angular, dense, gray-black against the stars. They moved in practiced formation, adjusting positions with the precision of something that had done this many times before. They did not rush. There was no urgency in their movements. That detail frightened me more than their size. Then the broadcast hit every frequency at once. Our systems translated it imperfectly but clearly enough. Species designation, human. Threat level, negligible. Planetary reduction, authorized. Estimated resistance duration, 72 hours. Owen read it off the screen twice without speaking. Then he said, quietly, that they had not called it a war, that they had called it a reduction. I did not answer him. I kept typing. Luna Base had 14 ships available at that moment, 2 cruisers scheduled for maintenance and 12 smaller vessels, a mix of frigates and civilian transports that happened to be docked when the attack began. Our base commander was a woman named Mara Sinclair. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, and had the kind of calm that is not natural but built through years of deliberate practice. She opened the command channel and said what needed to be said without spending a single word on anything unnecessary. She said the base had no shielding capable of withstanding the weapons being used below. She said 14 ships against that fleet was not a battle. She said the only rational course was to move the ships, the personnel, and as much data as we could carry to a position outside the immediate combat zone, regroup, and preserve the capacity to make future decisions. Nobody argued. We moved. The 14 ships left Luna Base in a loose formation and pushed hard for the system's outer boundary. The alien fleet did not chase us. They were still occupied with Earth's surface. That told me something about how they thought of us. We were not worth the diversion of resources. We were irrelevant, a handful of stragglers too small to bother with. I sat in the rear compartment of the cruiser called the Gray Anchor and continued working. A young technician named Finn Harlow sat across from me, still in his base uniform because there had been no time to change. He watched me type for a while, and then asked why I was still recording when there was nothing left to protect. I told him I was not recording to protect anything. I was recording to understand. He thought about that for a long moment. Then he asked me to share the files. That was the beginning of something. Not a plan yet, not even close. Just two people in a metal ship flying away from a burning planet, choosing to look at the data instead of looking away from it. We gathered at an emergency rally point beyond the outer system. Commander Sinclair held a channel meeting across all 14 ships and gave a direct account of what had happened. She estimated the number of people on Earth's surface during the strikes in the billions. She did not soften that number or surround it with careful language. She gave it plainly and let everyone sit with it. Then she asked if anyone had anything useful to add. Eli Vance, the commander of one of the frigates, said one thing. He said that the fleet had classified humans as a negligible threat. He said he wanted to know how they had arrived at that number and whether the number was correct. Something moved through the channel silence after he said that. Not hope. It was too early for hope, but something harder than despair and pointed. I said I had data. Sensor readings, frequency captures, ship signature profiles, fold point coordinates, weapon timing sequences. I said I did not know what it added up to yet, but I had it and I would keep building it. Mara Sinclair told me to keep building. The meeting ended. 14 ships drifted in the cold dark at the edge of our ruined system, and the people aboard them made the kind of silent choices that people make when they have lost everything and have to decide what they become next. I looked at my data pad. I had hours of recordings, terabytes of sensor information, enemy frequencies, weapon signatures, fold point mathematics. I had lost my home. I had lost most of my species. I had lost everything familiar and warm and certain. But I had the numbers, and the numbers were the first step towards something the alien fleet had not included in its calculations. They gave us 72 hours. We decided to take 3 years. 3 years in deep space does not feel like 3 years when every hour is occupied. It does not feel long when you are working. It feels like a single held breath that stretches across seasons. Every hour of those 3 years was used. Every mind aboard every ship was pointed at one purpose, and that purpose was not survival. We had already survived. The question was what we were going to do with the survival. I need to explain how 14 ships became a force worth fearing, because it did not happen the way stories usually describe it. There was no single genius who solved everything. There was no secret weapon sitting in a forgotten storage bay waiting to be discovered. What happened was slower and stranger, and in many ways more frightening than that. What happened was that human beings, with nowhere else to put their energy, became very focused. We moved the fleet into the Cathara Nebula 6 weeks after the attack. The nebula was dense enough to scatter most conventional sensor sweeps, and far enough from established trade routes that we were unlikely to receive uninvited visitors. It was cold and dark and completely unsuitable for anything comfortable. It was exactly what we needed. The first 6 months were brutal in a way that had nothing to do with enemy action. We had 14 ships not designed for long-term habitation. We had roughly 900 people across all vessels. We had limited food synthesis, limited medical supplies, and a constant grinding awareness that the civilization that had built all of our tools, systems, and supply chains was gone. People broke. Not everyone and not all at once, but it happened. There were nights, and in space a night is a choice, a decision to dim the lights on a schedule where the grief moved through the fleet like a physical thing. You could hear it in the comm channels. A question asked too quietly. A long pause before an answer came. A voice that started steady and then went rough in the middle of a routine report. I broke too. Once. I allowed myself one night in an empty equipment bay where I felt the full weight of what had been taken, and I did not fight it or redirect it or convert it into productivity. I just sat in it. It was the worst night of my life and also, in a strange way, one of the most important. Because when it was over, I understood something I had not fully understood before. The grief was fuel. It was not something to be overcome. It was something to be converted. I was not the only one who came to that conclusion. I watched it happen across the fleet in different ways and at different paces, but the direction was the same. People stopped looking back and started looking forward, and the look in their eyes when they looked forward was not warm. Mara Sinclair formalized what was already happening informally. She called it the Prometheus Doctrine, and the name spread quickly because it fit. The doctrine was not a military strategy in the traditional sense. It had no front lines, no formal rules of engagement, no reliance on overwhelming numbers or conventional advantage. It was built on the assumption that we would always be smaller, always be fewer, always be working with less. Given that assumption, the doctrine asked a single question: what do you do when you cannot match the enemy directly? The answer the doctrine gave was, you do not try. Instead, you study. You learn how the enemy thinks, how they plan, what they expect, and what they cannot imagine. Then you act only in the spaces they cannot imagine. You strike where they have not built defenses because it has never occurred to them that a strike could come from that direction. You use their confidence against them the way a current uses a stone, not fighting it, but flowing around it until the path you have carved is deeper than anything force alone could make. I wrote large portions of the Prometheus Doctrine alongside Eli Vance and a sharp, quiet engineer named Clara Holt, who had been aboard one of the civilian transports when the attack occurred. Clara had no military background at all. She had been a structural systems designer working on orbital habitats. What she brought to the table was a mind that thought in terms of load-bearing points. Find the single element that everything else depends on and focus your attention there. She was the one who identified the enemy supply chain as our primary target. She said their military power was immense and direct engagement would accomplish nothing. But their supply infrastructure, the fuel depots, the manufacturing stations, the ore transport networks that fed their shipbuilding capacity, that was a different kind of target. Disrupt the chain, she said, and the fleet becomes a very large, very expensive collection of metal sitting still. Finn Harlow had become our best signals analyst by the end of the first year. He had taken the raw data I collected during the attack and spent months dissecting it. He mapped the enemy communication protocols, identified the encryption patterns used for routine fleet coordination, and found a set of frequencies they broadcast on that they apparently considered too minor to protect carefully. Through those frequencies, we began to build a picture of their outer system activity, troop movements, supply shipments, patrol schedules. We also made contact with the Drawl. The Drawl were an insectoid species, highly intelligent, with a technological base nearly equal to the Vreth Empire that had conquered them. They had been absorbed into the Vreth Dominion 40 years before the attack on Earth. They were not slaves in the simplest sense. They were managed, constrained, their resources extracted, their development controlled, their expansion limited to corridors the Vreth permitted. They knew what had happened to Earth. They had been watching. A Drawl agent named Zeth made contact through the minor frequencies Finn had identified. The first message was brief and undecorated. It said, "We know what you are building. We want to help." The first 3 exchanges were cautious. We shared nothing critical. They shared nothing critical. Both sides were testing whether the other was real. Then Zeth sent us something that could not have been fabricated because it was too costly to fake. A complete layout of the Vreth Dominion's outer border defense network, patrol frequencies, station coordinates, the schedules of supply convoys moving along the 2 most critical logistics routes. The information was detailed, current, and confirmed against what Finn had already independently gathered from the open frequencies. They were telling us they were serious. I asked Mara Sinclair how we should respond. She thought for a moment and said we should tell them the truth, that we were not in a position to offer resources, protection, or guarantees. We could offer them exactly one thing: genuine partnership. Equal voice at every table where decisions were made. No hierarchy between the species. Shared risk and shared outcome. We sent that message to Zeth. The response came back in under an hour. It said, "That is the first time anyone has offered us that in 40 years. The alliance had no name and no ceremony. It was built on information shared and trust built slowly over 6 months of careful cooperation. But it was real, and it mattered in ways we could not fully measure yet. Meanwhile, the fleet was changing. We had started with 14 ships in various states of repair. By the end of the second year, we had 23. 3 were built from salvaged components gathered at the edges of dead space stations. 2 were draw vessels operating under joint command. The rest were our original ships, refitted and improved far beyond their original design specifications. The weapons we built were not copies of Vreth technology. We had studied their weapons closely enough to understand the physics behind them, and we had deliberately chosen different approaches. Our systems were designed not to be the strongest in a direct confrontation, but to be the most unexpected in the specific environments where we planned to use them. Every piece of equipment we built carried Clara Holt's logic in its design. Find the load-bearing point and apply force exactly there. A navigator named Aaron Cole had joined the command group by year 2. He was young, younger than most of us, but he had a quality I had never encountered quite so purely in anyone else. He could hold an enormous amount of conflicting information in his mind at once and move through it without losing the thread. He became the architect of our operational timing. Every strike we planned had to unfold across multiple systems simultaneously, confusing the enemy picture of where we were and what we were doing. By the end of year 3, we were ready. Not comfortable, not confident in the way that comes from believing nothing can go wrong, but ready in the way that a door is ready to open, because everything needed to open it is finally in place. The Galactic Conclave had heard rumors of us by then. Our fleet had been sighted twice at the edges of monitored space, and both sightings had gone into Conclave intelligence reports under the category of unconfirmed. Several species had sent quiet inquiries through channels that were technically unofficial. An ambassador from a species called the Sealeth sent a single-line message routed to us through Zeth's network. It said, "We did not know you were still alive." I wrote back personally. I said, neither did the Vreth. They had given us 72 hours. What they had actually given us was exactly enough time to become something they had no framework for understanding. We did not begin with fire. That was the first thing the Vreth failed to anticipate, because fire was the first move every military force in recorded galactic history had ever made. Begin with fire. Begin with direct confrontation. Measure strength against strength. It was the expected move. It was also the one we had no interest in making. We began with logistics. On a single coordinated night, across 11 separate locations spread through the outer sectors of the Vreth Dominion, 7 fuel depot stations went dark. Not destroyed, not at first. Shut down. Our teams moved in under signals cover provided by Finn Harlow's frequency maps, placed precision disruptors on the power relay systems, and left before a single alarm triggered. The depots went offline silently, the way a candle goes out when someone removes the air from around it. The Vreth response to the shutdowns was exactly what we had modeled. They assumed equipment failure. The Dominion's outer border region was vast and lightly administered, and technical failures in remote stations were not unusual. Repair teams were dispatched. Investigations were opened. The administrative response moved at the pace of bureaucracy in a large empire, which is to say, slowly. By the time the repair teams arrived at the first depot, we had already moved to the second phase. Zeth's intelligence had identified the 2 primary ore transport routes that fed the Vreth shipbuilding facilities in the mid-sector. Every 30 days, a convoy of 12 freighters made the run from the outer mining stations to the central yards. The convoys were large, slow, and escorted by a small number of patrol ships. The Vreth had never considered them targets because no force in the Dominion's history had ever found value in attacking supply lines rather than military assets directly. Aaron Cole had spent 4 months planning the interception timing. He gave it the designation Operation Pale Ember. Our fleet dropped out of fold at the convoy's midpoint when the escort ships were at their maximum distance from the freighters, executing a routine sweep of the surrounding area. We had timed the fold exit to a 40-second window. We hit that window exactly. But we did not fire on the freighters. Instead, we broadcast a message on the convoy's internal frequency. The message was addressed to the freighter crews and said the following: "This is a human vessel. You have 48 hours to move your ships to the designated safe coordinates I am transmitting to you now. After 48 hours, this route becomes impassable. We have no conflict with transport workers. Leave, and you will not be touched." Then we broadcast the same message on the emergency frequency. The escort ships were monitoring. The escort ships turned back immediately, closing the distance to the freighters at maximum speed. I watched them on the sensors and waited. Eli Vance asked me, over the command channel, whether I was certain about this. He said if we let the convoy go, we lost the element of surprise for the next attempt. I told him we were not trying to destroy a convoy. We were trying to change what the Vreth thought we were capable of. An enemy that gives warnings is more frightening than an enemy that simply strikes, because an enemy that gives warnings has decided it does not need to rush. It has decided it has enough time and enough resources to give you a chance you will regret not taking. The freighters held position. The escort ships surrounded them. For 18 hours, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the freighter captains made their own decisions. The first to move transmitted a brief message on an open channel saying only that they were civilian contractors and had families. Then they moved to the safe coordinates I had transmitted. By the 36th hour, 9 of the 12 freighters had complied. The remaining 3, under direct orders from a Vreth military commander who had arrived on the scene, held their position. At hour 48, we deployed the route denial system that Clara Holt had designed over the course of 2 years. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a distributed field of micro-signal disruptors, seated across a volume of space large enough to make fold-point navigation through that corridor completely unreliable for an extended period. The 3 freighters were not harmed. The route simply became unusable. The Vreth High Command's response, intercepted through Finn's frequency network, told us more than any battle assessment could have. There was confusion. There was disagreement about what category of threat to assign us. There were arguments about whether the warnings we had broadcast indicated weakness or an unknown tactical logic. They did not agree on an answer. That disagreement was the point. The next phase targeted something Zeth had flagged as deeply important to Vreth military culture: their projection of invulnerability to the species they governed. The Vreth Dominion controlled 40 star systems and managed dozens of subjugated species by maintaining a consistent image of overwhelming, unquestionable power. That image did not require constant demonstrations. It required the absence of any credible challenge. We were now a credible challenge. We selected the Vreth colony world of Kethsara in the outer administrative zone. It was not a military target. It was a resource extraction colony, home to around 400,000 Vreth civilians and a moderate garrison. We approached it openly and broadcast our presence on every available frequency 3 days before arrival. When we reached orbital distance, we did not fire a single weapon. We established a complete sensor and communications blockade around the planet. Nothing left the surface. Nothing reached it. We then transmitted one message to the colony's administration, to the garrison commander, and simultaneously to every galactic conclave monitoring station within range. The message said, "This colony is economically isolated until the Vreth Dominion agrees to open communication with human representatives. No one on this surface will be harmed. No supplies will be interdicted, but nothing from this colony will reach the Dominion's trade network, and nothing from the network will reach this colony until the Dominion acknowledges our existence." The garrison launched a full-force attack within 6 hours, exactly what their training told them to do. We did not meet it in the way they expected. Aaron Cole had mapped the garrison's likely attack vectors based on the tactical patterns Zeth had provided. We moved through those vectors the way water moves around placed stones, not engaging directly, not retreating, simply refusing to be where the attack was aimed. We were never in the position they fired at. We were always somewhere else, And from those somewhere else positions, we continued to tighten the blockade. The garrison exhausted 30% of its fuel reserves in 4 hours of pursuit that caught nothing. Then they stopped. The Vreth High Command's communication traffic went sharply elevated after that. Finn tracked the surge and told me he had never seen a spike like it from a military command structure that was supposedly winning. A Vreth admiral named Kathvara was assigned direct authority over the human problem. His first action was to dispatch a rapid response fleet of 40 ships toward our last confirmed position. His second action was to broadcast a threat on open military channels warning that any species found providing intelligence to the human faction would face collective consequences. That threat told us something critical. They had figured out we had inside information. They did not know it was the drawl. They were not sure of anything except that someone had talked. The threat also went out on frequencies monitored by every conclave member species. The Sealeth ambassador Aura sent us a message through Zeth's network the same day. It said, "You have the attention of the full chamber. Half of them are frightened of you. The other half are frightened of what happens if the Vreth win." Kathvara's 40 ships arrived at our last confirmed position and found empty space. We had moved 2 days before they arrived, using fold coordinates Zeth had provided through a routing path that bypassed 3 known Vreth sensor arrays. The fleet searched for 11 days, found nothing, and returned to base. In those 11 days, we had sealed 2 more supply routes, established contact with 3 additional subjugated species, and mapped the entire defensive architecture around the Vreth home system. Operation Pale Ember ended with the Vreth Dominion's outer sector in a state of low, persistent confusion. Nothing was catastrophically damaged. No military force had been crushed, but the absolute certainty that had moved through their fleet like gravity, the belief that they operated in a space where no challenge was possible, had developed a crack. And cracks, given enough pressure applied at exactly the right place, do not stop at cracks. The plan for the final engagement had one rule above all others: the galaxy had to see it. Not because we needed witnesses for our own sake, but because the species of the Galactic Conclave had spent years watching the Vreth Dominion operate with total impunity, and they needed to see, with absolute clarity and in real time, what the consequence of that silence looked like when the bill finally arrived. We broadcast our approach to the Vreth home system on open frequencies 48 hours before we arrived, not to give them time to prepare. They had been preparing for months. We broadcast it because every conclave monitoring station in range would pick up the signal, and every species with a receiver would know what was coming. Aura transmitted a brief acknowledgement. She said the conclave chamber had gone into emergency session the moment our broadcast was detected. She said they were debating whether to intervene. I said they are welcome to watch. She said nothing more, but the channel stayed open. Our fleet dropped out of fold at 17 points simultaneously around the Vreth home system. I want to be clear about what our fleet was by that point. It was not the 14 battered ships that had fled Luna Base 3 years earlier. It was 41 vessels, nearly half of which were captained and crewed by members of the 14 species the Vreth Dominion had subjugated over the past century. The Drawl had 3 ships in formation. The Sealeth had sent 2 observers who, on the day of the engagement, asked for permission to fight. I gave it. There were species in that fleet whose names most humans had never heard before, who had lived their entire lives under Vreth control and had never had a reason to believe that would change. They were there. They were ready. 1 flag flew on every ship, not a human flag. A new one, a design Finn Harlow had proposed and Clara Holt had refined, that none of the individual species had flown before. It meant nothing except, we chose this together. Vreth Admiral Kathvara opened a hail within 60 seconds of our arrival. I accepted it. He was composed. I will give him that. He looked at the sensor readouts on his end showing 41 ships positioned at 17 points around his home system, and his expression stayed professionally controlled. He spoke at length. He referred to humanity as a biological curiosity. He used the word primitive 3 times. He described our alliance with subjugated species as desperation, and said that desperation had a recognizable shape that always ended the same way. I let him finish completely. I did not interrupt once. Then I shared my screen with him. He saw the targeting data. He saw 41 ships with every system active and every targeting solution locked. He saw the combined fleet readiness report, not just the human ships but all of them, fully charged, fully crewed, fully committed. I played his own broadcast back to him, the one from 3 years ago. Species designation, human, threat level, negligible, planetary reduction, authorized. Estimated resistance duration, 72 hours. I let it finish. Then I said, "You gave us 72 hours. I would like to give you 48. Move your civilian population to the designated safe coordinates I am transmitting now. Military vessels may stand down or evacuate to outer system coordinates. After 48 hours, we engage everything that remains." He said he would not negotiate with a dead species. I said, "Then pay close attention because you are going to have to update your records." The engagement began. Aaron Cole ran the tactical coordination from the Gray Anchor's command deck. He had spent months building a model of the Vreth home system's defensive layout, and the model was accurate. Every defensive station, every orbital platform, every patrol corridor mapped, and our engagement designed around one central principle. We were not there to demonstrate power. We were there to make them understand that their power had a ceiling, and we had found it. The Vreth launched their full defensive force within the first 10 minutes. It was enormous. Even accounting for the damage we had done to their supply capacity over the previous months, their home system defense was substantial. In raw numbers, they outmatched us considerably. Raw numbers were not what this engagement was about. Finn Harlow's signals team jammed the Vreth fleet command frequencies at the precise moment their defensive force reached maximum deployment. Not a full blackout, a surgical interference that disrupted only the fleet-wide coordination channels while leaving individual ship communication intact. It was a capability he had been developing for 2 years, designed specifically for this moment. Kothvara could still talk to his ships. He just could not talk to all of them at the same time, in the organized way a coordinated defense requires. Their formation fractured into segments. We did not try to defeat each segment. We simply moved. Aaron's navigation plan pushed our fleet through the gaps in the fractured Vreth formation, never holding a fixed position long enough to be surrounded, never committing to a direct exchange that would favor their numbers. We moved like a current through their defense, and every time we moved, we tightened the ring around the inner system. Clara's logic was applied to the Vreth home system's power grid. There were 3 primary stations that fed the entire defensive network. She had identified them from astronomical data and confirmed them from Zeth's intelligence. We assigned 6 ships to each station and held them as secondary targets, not engaged immediately, held in reserve, so that Kothvara knew they were there and had to commit resources to protecting them. That commitment split his force further. 40 minutes into the engagement, the first Vreth civilian broadcast reached the open frequencies. It was a population plea addressed to the Galactic Conclave, asking for immediate intervention. The Conclave chamber, as I learned later from Aura's account, went absolutely still. The chair called a vote on intervention. Every member species was given 30 seconds to register. The result was unanimous abstention. Not one species moved to help the Vreth Dominion. I heard the result over Aura's open channel and allowed myself exactly 2 seconds of stillness before returning to the command screens. Kothvara opened a hail again at the 90-minute mark. The control in his voice was gone. He asked what we wanted. I told him what we wanted had not changed. Civilian evacuation to safe coordinates, military vessels standing down or withdrawing. After that, the Vreth Dominion and humanity would sit at the same table and determine together what came next. He asked why we had not simply destroyed the home system. I said, because this was never about destruction. He was quiet for a long time. I could see him processing the fact that the species his empire had classified as negligible had just delivered a result that the most powerful force in the known galaxy had not encountered in a century of dominance. He gave the stand-down order 4 hours after the engagement began. It was orderly. Whatever else they were, the Vreth military followed its command structure with discipline, and when the command changed, the transition was clean. Ships pulled back. Stations powered down their targeting systems. The civilian evacuation proceeded according to the plan we had transmitted. The engagement ended without a single civilian casualty on either side. Our fleet held its positions. We did not advance into the inner system. We did not occupy anything. We simply remained at every one of our 17 points, visible and present and impossible to ignore. On every frequency that Conclave monitoring stations tracked, the whole thing had played out in real time. Aura's open channel was still live. She said in a voice that was very quiet that the chamber had been watching without speaking. She said that, when the stand-down came and the casualty figures began to be assessed, minimal on both sides, 0 civilian, the silence in the chamber had changed in quality. She said she was not sure she had the right words for what kind of silence it was. I told her I thought I understood. I looked around the gray anchor's command deck. Owen Clark was at his station, his face drawn and focused. Finn Harlow was running post-engagement frequency analysis, his hands moving with the automatic ease of someone who had been doing the same work for 3 years. Aaron Cole had leaned back in his chair and was staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has been holding a very complicated thought for a very long time and has just finally been allowed to set it down. I thought about Mara Sinclair, who had died in the 14th month in a reactor accident and had not lived to see this day. I thought about Eli Vance, commanding a ship on the other side of the Vreth home system right now. I thought about Zeth, whose risk in providing us intelligence had been greater than any of ours. I thought about the 3 billion and more who had been on Earth's surface when it burned. The Vreth Dominion had told us that our estimated resistance duration was 72 hours. What they had not known was that the most dangerous thing you can do to a human being is convince them, at the moment of greatest loss, that the situation is hopeless. Because some people hear hopeless and stop. And some people hear hopeless and start making calculations. 6 months after the Vreth home system engagement, I stood before the Galactic Conclave Assembly on New Geneva Station, and I was the quietest person in a room that held 10,000 beings representing 200 species. Let me describe that room, because its physical reality matters. New Geneva Station was built at a gravitational midpoint between 3 inhabited systems, a compromised location chosen because it belonged entirely to no one. The assembly hall was spherical, with every species arranged in tiered sections curving around a central speaking platform. The air was managed to accommodate dozens of different atmospheric requirements at once, which gave it a slightly metallic quality. The sound system translated everything in real time into every registered language in the Conclave database. When I walked to the central platform, the room did not react with noise or motion. It went still. 200 species watching one human being walk to the center of a sphere and stand there, and the collective decision of that room was to hold its breath. I had prepared for this moment in ways I had not prepared for the engagement at Vreth Prime. The engagement had required precision and timing, and 3 years of operational planning. This required something different. It required me to say things that were true in a room full of beings who had made choices that mattered, and who needed to hear those truths clearly and without the kind of anger that makes it easy to dismiss what you are hearing. I did not come to make them afraid of us. I had already done that, whether I intended to or not. I came to make them responsible. I began by telling them what they already knew, that humanity had survived, that we had spent 3 years in the dark building a force and an alliance from nothing, that we had engaged the Vreth home system's defenses, ended the engagement with minimal casualties on all sides, and delivered a clear political outcome. These were the facts of what had happened, stated plainly. Then I said what they did not know I knew. I told them that before the attack on Earth, a Vreth diplomatic transmission had passed through the Conclave's information exchange, a transmission in which the Dominion notified the Conclave of its intentions toward a species designated as non-member. I told them I had the timestamp, the routing signature, and the access logs showing which member species had received and opened that transmission before the attack took place. The silence changed. 200 species in a spherical room, and the silence shifted into something with a different texture, heavier, more careful, the kind of quiet that comes when a large number of beings simultaneously decide to stay very still. I said I was not there to prosecute anyone. I was not a court. I did not have the authority to determine guilt or assign consequences for what had been a political decision made by sovereign entities. But I said that decision had allowed the deaths of more than 3 billion people. And I said the moral reality of that choice did not disappear because it had been made quietly and could not be formally adjudicated. The conclave chair asked me, after a pause that lasted nearly a full minute, what humanity wanted. I said we wanted 3 things, and I wanted to be very clear that I was calling them demands, not requests. The first demand was formal recognition of humanity as a full conclave member with equal standing, effective immediately, with no probationary classification and no membership tier below that of any existing member species. The second demand was the establishment of a conclave accountability mechanism with real authority, a body empowered to investigate actions by any member species that affected the life and welfare of non-member species, with the power to impose actual consequences and not merely advisory resolutions. The third demand was the immediate and formal recognition of the 14 species that had allied with us as full conclave members, with the same standing we were requesting for ourselves. That third demand changed the atmosphere of the room more than anything else I said, not the accountability mechanism, which threatened the powerful, and not our own membership, which had been anticipated. The demand for the 14 subjugated species to receive equal standing was not what anyone had prepared for. I explained why I had made it. I said that humanity had survived because those species had helped us. I said the help they gave was not given out of desperation or because they had no other choice. It was given because they saw in us, perhaps for the first time in their long experience of the galaxy, a power that was willing to treat them as partners rather than resources. I said we intended to honor that, and that our own membership was worth nothing to us if it was achieved at the expense of the people who had made it possible. I stopped speaking. I had said what I came to say, and I was not going to add to it or soften it or explain it further. The Sealath ambassador Aura rose from the Sealath section. She was tall and angular-faced, and she stood very straight in a way that communicated something clear even across the species barrier. She said, "The Sealath delegation seconds all 3 demands as presented and calls for an immediate vote." The room responded. Not with noise. That is the part I have tried to describe to people since and never quite managed to capture. It did not respond with applause or outcry or argument. One by one, across the tiered sections, individual delegations rose. Some species rose as full groups. Some sent a single representative forward. The 14 species who had fought alongside us rose together in a coordinated movement that told me they had planned it in advance, that they had talked among themselves, and decided they would do this no matter how the room felt about it. The vote was called. Recognition of humanity as a full conclave member, passed. Establishment of an accountability mechanism with enforcement authority, passed with 11 abstentions. Recognition of the 14 allied species as full conclave members, passed. The conclave chair recorded the results and announced them in the formal language of the body. When it was done, I was still standing on the central platform, and the room had gone quiet again, but in a different way. The kind of quiet that comes after something has shifted permanently and every being present knows it. I had one more thing to say that was not part of the demands. I said I wanted to speak briefly, not as humanity's representative, but as an individual who had been at Luna Base 3 years ago and watched the planet below him burn. I said I understood why the Conclave had made the choices it made. I did not mean that the way people mean it when they want to soften a criticism. I meant it factually. The Conclave was a structure built to manage relationships between species who each had their own interests and their own fears, and their own reasons for wanting the powerful to remain at a distance from their borders. Humanity had not been a member. Humanity had not been, from the Conclave's perspective, a relevant factor. The math of that position was coherent. I said the problem with coherent math was that it did not account for what it felt like to be on the other side of it. I said that 3 billion and more people had been on the other side of that math, and they had not survived to express an opinion on it. I said I was not asking the Conclave to carry that as guilt, because guilt was not what I needed from them. I was asking them to carry it as memory, as a weight that stayed present in every decision made in this room going forward. Not as punishment, but as ballast, the thing that keeps a structure from drifting too far from the truth of what it exists to do. I said the Conclave existed, in theory, to protect the right of every species to exist and develop without being reduced by the power of its neighbors. I said humanity was willing to work within that structure, to strengthen it, to be a voice and a force within it for exactly that purpose. But I said we would also be watching. Not as a threat, as a function, as the thing that a near extinction changes you into, whether you want it to or not, a species that can never again hear the word negligible without knowing exactly what it costs. I stepped back from the central platform, or across the room to meet me. She was followed by the representatives of the 14 allied species, moving in a loose group toward the platform from their respective sections. Behind them, several other Conclave members who had not spoken during the session began to move as well, quietly, without ceremony, crossing the floor to be present in a way that meant something even without words. I stood in the center of that gathering and felt the weight of the moment in a way I had not felt the weight of the engagement or the years of planning or even the night I sat in the equipment bay and let the grief move through me. This was a different kind of weight, not heavy in the way of grief, but dense, full of everything it had taken to arrive here and everything it would take going forward. Owen Clark was in the observation gallery above the assembly floor. He found my eye through the transparent partition and held up his data pad, the same gesture he had made 3 years ago in the rear compartment of the gray anchor, asking me to share the files. I almost smiled. Finn Harlow was beside him, not looking at me but at the floor of the assembly, cataloging everything with the same focused attention he had brought to 3 years of signals work. Some habits run too deep to pause even for history. Aaron Cole was back on the gray anchor, preparing a report on the voting patterns and what they suggested about the political alignments we would need to navigate going forward. He had told me before I entered the assembly that this was not an ending, and that I should not walk in there thinking it was. He was right. He usually was. Earth was rebuilding. That fact deserves to be stated plainly, because the magnitude of it is easy to lose in the details of everything surrounding it. The planet had been through something that should, by any reasonable measure, have ended it. 3 billion plus lives gone. Infrastructure across entire continents destroyed. The ecological systems of the surface disrupted in ways that would take generations to fully recover. And yet, the people who had survived were not waiting, and they were not paralyzed. They were doing what the species does when it is faced with a condition it did not choose and cannot undo. They were adapting. New systems were being built, not replicas of the old ones, but something more durable, more distributed, designed by people who understood exactly what a centralized infrastructure looks like when someone decides to target it from orbit. The agricultural networks were different. The power grids were different. The cities being reconstructed looked nothing like the ones that had stood before, because the architects designing them were people who had grown up knowing what had happened to the ones that came before and were making different choices. A generation of children was growing up on that planet who had never known the before. They knew the story because we would not let it be forgotten, but they did not know it as memory. They knew it as history, the thing that had made the world they lived in what it was. Some of them were angry. Some of them were determined. Most of them were both. I thought about those children sometimes when the work felt too heavy, or the decisions too consequential, or the distance from home too wide to hold comfortably. I thought about what they would inherit from what we were building here. Not a perfect system. There is no such thing as a perfect system of governance between beings who each have their own needs and their own fears, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not been paying attention. What they would inherit was a structure with a memory, a conclave with an accountability mechanism that had teeth, a coalition of species who had learned, at significant cost, what happens when you decide to stay quiet while the powerful make decisions about who is worth protecting. That was not nothing. That was the most important thing any of us could leave behind. Aura stood beside me as the gallery began to empty. She was not a being who spoke beyond what was necessary, but before she returned to the Sealeth delegation, she said one thing I have kept with me since. She said that the Sealeth had a concept in their oldest philosophical tradition, a word that translated loosely as the pressure that reveals what something is made of. They applied it to metals, to structures, to individuals, to civilizations. She said humanity had been subjected to a version of that pressure that no civilization in the conclave's recorded history had survived in any form that resembled what they had been before. She said we had come out of it recognizable. She said that was, in her tradition, the rarest outcome. I held those words for a long time after she left. I had made myself a promise when I stood at the window of Luna Base and watched the planet below me burn. I told myself I would not allow myself to cry until it was finished. Not in the first days when the grief was enormous and the situation was desperate. Not during the 3 years in the dark. Not during the engagement. Not in the moments after. When it was finished, I would let myself feel the weight of all of it at once. Standing in the empty assembly hall of New Geneva Station, with the vote recorded and the demands accepted, and the names of 14 species added to the conclave's membership rolls for the first time in their histories, I decided that finished was close enough. One tear, not from weakness, I want to be clear about that, not from relief exactly. From the simple acknowledgement that the people who had not survived deserved to be mourned by someone who had, and that I had been carrying that acknowledgement sealed inside me for 3 years like something too fragile to open while still in motion. I let it fall. Then I picked up my data pad, opened a channel to the gray anchor, and told Aaron Cole to begin preparing the agenda for humanity's first official session as a full conclave member. He asked me how the speech had gone. I said it had gone the way things go when they are true. He said that was not a very specific answer. I said no, but it is an accurate one. The gray anchor confirmed receipt of the post-session data package. Finn's analysis was already running. The work was already continuing. The galaxy had watched us arrive in this room and make demands and receive them, and now the harder, longer, less dramatic work of making those demands mean something real over time was beginning. They had burned our world to silence us. What they had created instead was a species that had learned, in the hardest possible way, what it cost to go unheard. We were heard now, and we intended to make sure that every civilization that might one day find itself classified as negligible by something larger and more powerful than itself would be heard as well. Not because we were heroes. We were not heroes. We were survivors who had made a series of choices about what to do with the survival, and not all of those choices had been clean or simple or free of cost. But we were here. And in the end, being here, standing in the room, speaking plainly, refusing to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's history, that was the point. That had always been the point.